They say a wedding day reveals who will stand beside you when the ground begins to shift. The wind off Lake Briarwood carried the scent of rain and distant pine that afternoon, rolling low across the quiet shoreline where a small white arch had been set up near the water's edge. Folding chairs, barely 24 of them, faced the narrow wooden dock that stretched 10 yards into the lake, its planks pale and weathered like old bones warmed by summer sun. Ethan Cole had not come for a wedding. He had come for work, hauling scrap lumber for a marina owner who paid in cash and asked few questions. At 40, Ethan carried the steady build of a man who had learned to endure more than he explained, broad shoulders beneath a faded denim jacket, boots scuffed from miles of gravel roads, gray-blue eyes that watched quietly before deciding anything at all. Beside him moved Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat brushed in black and honey gold, his ears tall and alert, his amber gaze always scanning, always listening. Ranger paused before Ethan did. The dog's head tilted slightly toward the dock where a bride in a simple ivory gown sat in a polished wheelchair adorned with small white roses. Her veil fluttered in the breeze like a flag unsure of its allegiance. The groom stood a few steps behind her, stiff in a tailored navy suit, checking his phone more than he checked her expression. The officiant's voice drifted faintly across the water, warm and practiced. Ranger's posture shifted. His muscles tightened beneath his thick fur, and a low, uncertain sound hummed in his chest. Not fear, not aggression, but recognition of something misaligned. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and noticed how the far end of the dock dipped almost imperceptibly under the combined weight of ceremony and expectation. A loose bolt glinted near one of the posts. The lake, calm moments before, stirred as a larger boat passed farther out, its wake rippling toward the narrow boards. Ranger let out 3 short, deliberate barks. Heads turned. The bride's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair, her knuckles pale against the satin fabric pooled in her lap. A gust of wind swept across the water, pressing the veil against her shoulders. Ethan stepped forward without thinking, boots striking wood as the first tremor ran beneath the dock like a breath drawn too sharply. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply moved. Ranger surged beside him, positioning himself near the bride's chair, his body angled as if already calculating balance and distance. The dock dipped again, subtle but certain. Guests gasped, shifting backward toward shore. The groom froze, uncertainty rooting him in place. Ethan reached the bride just as another ripple struck the boards, his hands steady on the handles of her chair, his voice calm and even. "I've got you," he said, as if that promise were the most ordinary thing in the world. Ranger pressed close, anchoring his weight beside the wheel, eyes locked not on the crowd but on the bride herself. And in that suspended moment between fear and faith, something deeper than ceremony began to unfold. The dock settled with a long wooden sigh instead of a crack, dipping just enough to tilt the moment without breaking it. Ethan felt the shift through the soles of his boots, subtle but real, like the tremor before a storm reaches shore. He tightened his grip on the wheelchair handles and guided it backward 1 steady inch at a time, while Ranger leaned his weight against the outer wheel, bracing with quiet precision. The lake slapped softly against the posts, sending small waves that licked the edge of the boards. Guests retreated towards solid ground, their polished shoes scraping nervously across wood. The officiant lowered his book. Somewhere behind them a woman whispered a prayer. Ethan did not look at the groom. He did not need to. The man had already stepped back toward the grass, phone clutched in one hand, expression pale and uncertain as though inconvenience had replaced devotion. The bride's breathing was calm, slower than Ethan expected. Her hands, delicate but steady, rested lightly over his forearm as if she were reassuring him instead of the other way around. Up close he noticed the faint scent of lavender and lake water clinging to her veil. Her eyes were a clear shade of blue that did not waver even as the dock dipped once more beneath another passing ripple. Ranger's ears remained upright, tracking every vibration through the wood. When they reached the shore, Ethan guided the chair onto the grass and turned it so the wheels faced away from the unstable planks. Only then did he release his hold. The bride exhaled, not in panic, but in something closer to recognition. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice smooth and composed. as though she had always expected someone would step forward. Ethan nodded once. "You are safe now," he replied, his tone low and even. Ranger circled once and settled at her side, sitting tall, amber eyes studying her face rather than the scattered guests. A breeze lifted the veil again, brushing against his fur. The groom approached slowly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "It was just a loose board," he muttered, though his gaze drifted toward the parking lot where a line of luxury vehicles shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Ethan noticed the smallest details without meaning to. The subtle emblems stitched into the bride's satin gloves, the diamond at her finger that caught the light with quiet authority, the way two men in dark suits stood near a black sedan at the edge of the gravel drive, watching with measured attention. They were not relatives. They carried themselves like men accustomed to protecting more than appearances. The bride followed Ethan's glance and offered the faintest smile, one that carried more understanding than explanation. "I suppose this is what they call a test," she murmured, though it was unclear whether she spoke to him or to herself. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head briefly against her knee, a gesture he reserved for moments when something unseen pressed against the air. Ethan felt it too, not danger but significance, the quiet turning of something larger than a broken dock. Around them, guests whispered, uncertain whether to resume the ceremony or abandon it altogether. The groom's voice rose in mild frustration about liability and insurance. The bride did not respond. Instead, she looked at Ethan again, studying the worn denim at his cuffs, the faded watch at his wrist, the steadiness in his posture. "You did not hesitate," she said. "Some things are not meant to be watched from a distance," he answered simply. For a moment the wind fell still. The lake smoothed into glass, reflecting the pale sky above as though nothing had disturbed it at all. Yet Ethan sensed that the true shift had not happened beneath the dock. It had happened in the space between a stranger's need and a choice made without calculation. And as Ranger's tail brushed lightly against the bride's gown, the faintest hint of a different future stirred beneath the quiet afternoon sun. The ceremony did not resume. It dissolved instead, like mist under rising sunlight, guests gathering their purses and jackets with murmurs about unstable boards and unfortunate timing. The officiant spoke quietly with the event coordinator near the folding chairs, their voices low and professional. The groom stood apart near the gravel drive, one hand pressed against his forehead, as if calculating losses no one else could see. Ethan stepped back, giving space he believed was not his to occupy. Ranger remained seated beside the bride, his posture calm but attentive, as though he had chosen his place and intended to keep it. The two men in dark suits approached at an unhurried pace, their shoes silent against the grass. One of them leaned slightly toward the bride and spoke her name with a respect that carried more weight than familiarity. "Miss Whitmore, the vehicle is ready when you are." The name settled in Ethan's mind without context, just a detail filed away among others. The bride turned her chair a fraction toward Ethan before responding. "Thank you, Daniel. Give us a moment." Her tone was gentle, but it held authority. The man nodded once and stepped back. Ethan felt Ranger's gaze shift from the bride to the black sedan parked beneath a tall oak tree. The vehicle's windows were tinted, its surface polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the lake and sky as though they belonged to it. It was not the kind of car that attended modest ceremonies. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Do you need help getting to the car?" he asked. "I manage well enough," she replied, though she did not move yet. Instead, she studied him again, not with curiosity, but with consideration. "What is your name?" "Ethan Cole." "And your partner?" She nodded toward Ranger. "Ranger," he said, a faint warmth entering his voice at the sound of it. Ranger's tail brushed the grass once, deliberate and slow. The bride reached down carefully and rested her hand against the top of his head. Ranger did not flinch. He lowered his ears slightly in acknowledgement, accepting her touch as if it had been offered before. "He trusts you," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "He trusts what he senses." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then perhaps I should feel honored." A breeze lifted strands of her veil again, but the wind had lost its edge. The lake lay still now, wide and reflective. From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw the groom speaking sharply with one of the suited men, gesturing toward the dock as if demanding explanations. The bride did not look in that direction. Some structures, she said after a moment, her gaze still on the water, are not meant to carry weight they were never built for. Ethan did not answer, though he understood more than she might have expected. He had seen foundations fail before, in places far from lakes and white arches. Silence settled between them, but it did not feel empty. It felt measured. Finally, she turned her chair slightly toward the sedan. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. Ethan hesitated only briefly before nodding. He walked at her side as Ranger moved ahead, scanning the path instinctively. The suited men opened the car door with practiced ease. As she prepared to enter, she paused and looked up at Ethan once more. "You arrived here by accident?" she asked. "I was hauling lumber," he replied. "Nothing more." She studied his expression, perhaps searching for something unsaid. "Nothing more," she repeated softly, as if testing the phrase for truth. Then she reached into the small satin pouch at her wrist and withdrew a simple white card. She held it out to him without explanation. The paper was thick, embossed with a single silver crest and a name written in clean lettering. "If you ever need something more," she said, her voice steady, "call that number." Ethan accepted the card, though he did not look down at it yet. Ranger stood still beside him, eyes fixed on her as though memorizing her presence. The door closed gently, sealing her inside the quiet luxury of tinted glass and polished leather. As the sedan rolled away along the gravel drive, Ethan felt an unfamiliar weight in his hand, not heavy like money, not sharp like obligation, but significant in a way he could not yet define. Ranger gave one soft huff and looked up at him, ears tilted forward. Ethan finally glanced down at the card, the silver crest catching the late afternoon sun, and sensed that the dock had not been the only thing shifting beneath the surface of that day. The gravel drive emptied slowly after. The black sedan disappeared beyond the curve of maple trees, leaving behind a faint trail of dust that settled over the trimmed grass and folding chairs. Ethan remained where he stood for several seconds, the white card resting between his fingers as if it carried its own temperature. Ranger shifted his weight and nudged Ethan's hand lightly, a reminder that standing still too long was rarely their way. The late afternoon sun dipped lower over Lake Briarwood, casting a muted gold across the water that made the entire shoreline appear softer than it had an hour earlier. Workers began disassembling the white arch near the shore, their voices practical and detached, already moving on to the next obligation. Ethan slipped the card into the inside pocket of his denim jacket without studying it further. He had learned long ago that not every door needed to be opened the moment it appeared. Ranger trotted beside him as he crossed the marina lot toward his aging pickup truck, a silver Ford with rust lining the wheel wells and a cracked leather bench seat that still held the faint scent of motor oil and pine cleaner. The truck started on the second turn of the key, engine rumbling in a low, familiar tone. Ethan rested his forearms against the steering wheel for a moment before shifting into drive. The lake receded in the rearview mirror, shrinking into a quiet strip of blue between tall trees. They drove east along County Road 14, passing weathered barns and long stretches of fence that bent slightly under the weight of years. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears angled toward the open window where late summer air drifted in. Ethan could feel the card against his chest through the fabric of his jacket. It felt out of place there, like something too clean for the life he had grown accustomed to. By the time they reached the small town of Millhaven, the sky had turned a deeper shade of amber. Ethan pulled into the gravel lot behind a modest roadside diner where he sometimes traded odd repair jobs for hot meals. The neon sign flickered gently in the window, reflecting against chrome trim and polished countertops inside. He stepped out, stretching his shoulders as Ranger jumped down beside him. The bell above the diner door chimed softly when they entered. A few regulars glanced up and nodded in recognition. The scent of coffee and fried onions lingered in the warm air. "Evening, Ethan," called Mrs. Porter from behind the counter, her gray hair tied neatly in a bun. "You look like you ran into weather." "Something like that," he replied, sliding into a booth near the window. Ranger lay at his feet, chin resting on crossed paws, eyes half closed but never fully unaware. As Ethan waited for his plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he reached into his jacket and finally removed the card. He turned it over slowly beneath the fluorescent lights. The silver crest shimmered faintly. Beneath it was a name printed in precise lettering. Charlotte Whitmore, Whitmore Holdings. The phone number followed, simple and direct. Ethan studied the name without recognition. He did not follow markets or corporate headlines. His world had narrowed over the years to daily labor and quiet survival. Yet something about the way the suited men had stood at attention, the way the groom had stepped aside so easily, lingered in his thoughts. Across the diner, a television mounted above the counter played the evening news at low volume. A headline scrolled beneath footage of a glass skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The anchor's voice drifted faintly across the room, mentioning a Whitmore philanthropic initiative expanding into veteran rehabilitation services nationwide. Ethan's fork paused midair. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift in his posture. On the screen appeared a photograph of Charlotte Whitmore standing beside a ribbon-cutting ceremony, her wheelchair polished, her expression composed and resolute. The same clear blue eyes looked out from the screen, framed by tailored elegance instead of a wedding veil. The caption beneath her image read, "Heir to Whitmore Holdings announces major investment in community care." Ethan lowered his fork slowly. Around him, dishes clinked and coffee refilled as though nothing had changed. But inside the small booth by the window, a different understanding settled into place. The dock had not been an accident of loose boards alone, and the card in his hand no longer felt like a simple courtesy. It felt like an invitation written long before he ever stepped onto that shifting wood. The television continued its quiet broadcast long after the headlines shifted to weather and local traffic, but Ethan no longer heard the words clearly. The name on the card in his hand now carried weight, context, gravity. Charlotte Whitmore was not simply a bride on an unstable dock. She was the face of a national foundation, a name tied to hospitals, housing projects, and veteran rehabilitation centers stretching from Illinois to the Pacific Northwest. Ethan folded the card once and slid it back into his jacket, finishing his meal without tasting much of it. Ranger watched him closely, amber eyes steady, as if measuring the change in his breathing rather than the sound in the room. Outside, Millhaven settled into evening. The sky deepened to violet behind the grain silos at the edge of town, and a soft line of headlights traced the highway like a quiet procession. Ethan climbed back into his pickup, the metal door closing with a familiar hollow thud. He did not start the engine immediately. Instead, he rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared at the reflection of the diner lights across the windshield. He had spent years avoiding anything that carried the scent of power or wealth. Those worlds moved with expectations he did not trust. Ranger shifted on the bench seat and rested his chin against Ethan's forearm, the gesture simple and grounding. "It does not change what happened," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Ranger blinked once, as if agreeing. They drove north toward the edge of town, where Ethan had parked his camper trailer beneath a stand of cottonwoods near an old irrigation canal. The trailer was small, just 18 feet long, with peeling paint and a propane heater that rattled when it ran. It was not much, but it was quiet, and quiet had become a form of shelter. Ethan stepped inside and switched on the single overhead light. The space smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. Ranger circled once on the worn rug before settling down near the door. Ethan removed his jacket and placed it carefully on the small table by the window. The card slipped free and landed face up against the wood. He looked at it for a long moment before picking it up again. The silver crest seemed almost out of place in the dim trailer light, too refined for chipped cabinets and patched linoleum floors. He reached for his old flip phone on the counter, the plastic scratched from years of use. His thumb hovered over the keypad. Outside, wind moved softly through the cottonwood leaves, creating a steady whisper against the aluminum siding. Ethan exhaled slowly and set the phone back down. He was not ready to call, not because of fear, but because he needed to understand why the invitation had been offered at all. Ranger rose unexpectedly and moved toward the narrow window, ears angled forward. A pair of headlights rolled slowly along the dirt access road beyond the canal, not speeding, not lingering, just passing. Ethan felt a flicker of awareness, not alarm, but observation. The vehicle continued on without stopping. Ranger relaxed again, returning to his place on the rug. Ethan poured himself a glass of water from the small sink and leaned against the counter. He remembered the way Charlotte had said the word test, not as a complaint, but as recognition. He recalled the steadiness in her voice, the way she had asked for his name without hesitation. He had seen many expressions in his life: fear, pride, regret. What he had seen in her eyes on that dock had not been panic. It had been evaluation. The thought unsettled him, not because it suggested deception, but because it implied intention. He walked to the small fold-out bed and sat down, the mattress creaking beneath his weight. Ranger lifted his head and watched him in the dim light. "If this is something more," Ethan said quietly, "it needs to mean more than money." The trailer fell silent except for the wind. On the table, the silver crest caught the faint glow from the overhead bulb, reflecting it back in a soft, steady gleam, as if waiting patiently for a decision that would not be made in haste. Morning arrived slowly over the cottonwoods, pale light filtering through thin branches and laying soft stripes across the aluminum walls of the trailer. Ethan had not slept deeply. He had drifted in and out of memory, of docks and distant roads, of faces that came and went without permanence. Ranger rose before the alarm on Ethan's phone had the chance to vibrate, stretching carefully before stepping toward the narrow window. The air outside held the cool scent of damp earth and irrigation water moving quietly through the canal. Ethan sat up and ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of unfinished decisions settle with the new day. The card still rested on the small table, its silver crest calm and unchanging in the early light. He stood, brewed a simple pot of coffee on the propane burner, and watched steam rise in thin, twisting ribbons. Ranger waited near the door, ears attentive but relaxed. After breakfast, Ethan slipped the card into his jacket pocket once more and stepped outside. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that promised heat by noon. He had fence posts to reset at a small ranch 10 miles west, work that required steady hands and little conversation. The drive along the county road felt ordinary, fields of corn stretching in measured rows, silos standing tall against the horizon. Yet Ethan noticed details more sharply than usual: the way the wind brushed the crops in waves, the way Ranger's head turned each time another vehicle passed. By late morning, sweat dampened the back of his shirt as he hammered the final post into firm ground. The ranch owner, a widower in his 60s, handed him folded bills with a nod of appreciation. "You ever think about settling somewhere permanent?" the man asked casually. Ethan gave a faint half-smile. "Permanent can be fragile," he replied. Ranger stood at his side, gaze lifted toward the distant tree line as though scanning for something only he could sense. They finished the job and returned to the truck. Instead of turning back toward the trailer, Ethan paused at the intersection where the road split toward Millhaven. He rested his hand over the pocket where the card waited. Ranger leaned forward slightly, tail still, eyes bright. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned the wheel toward town. The diner's parking lot was nearly empty at midday. Inside, the hum of refrigeration units and the scent of fresh coffee filled the quiet space. Ethan slid into the same booth near the window. Ranger settled beneath the table, his body close to Ethan's boots. The card lay on the table now, smooth and uncreased. Ethan took out his phone and stared at the number printed beneath Charlotte Whitmore's name. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, its tires whispering against asphalt. He pressed the first digit, then the second, listening to the faint electronic tones echo in his ear. Each number felt deliberate, like stepping onto a bridge without knowing its strength. When the final digit was entered, he held the phone to his ear and waited. The line rang. Once, then twice. A calm, professional voice answered on the third ring. "Whitmore Holdings. How may I direct your call?" Ethan glanced down at Ranger, whose ears had lifted at the subtle change in his breathing. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said evenly. "I was given this number yesterday." There was a brief pause, followed by a soft shift in tone. "Yes, Mr. Cole. Miss Whitmore has been expecting your call." The words settled into the quiet booth like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan felt Ranger's shoulder press lightly against his leg, grounding and steady. "She would like to meet with you this afternoon, if you are available," the voice continued. "A car can be sent to your location." Ethan looked out the window at the modest storefronts of Millhaven, at the simple life that had asked little of him beyond honest labor. "That will not be necessary," he replied. "Tell her I will come." He ended the call and sat in silence for a moment, listening to the low hum of the diner. Ranger's amber eyes met his, calm and unwavering. Outside, The sky stretched wide and unclouded, and somewhere beyond the familiar roads of Millhaven, a different kind of structure waited to see whether it could bear the weight of what was about to cross its threshold. The address sent to Ethan's phone led beyond Millhaven, past the grain elevators and the low brick storefronts, toward a stretch of highway that curved south toward the city. He drove his old pickup steadily, Ranger seated upright beside him, the late afternoon sun angling through the windshield in long, warm beams. Traffic thickened as they neared the outskirts of Brookhaven, where glass buildings began to rise above tree lines and billboards reflected corporate names in polished lettering. Ethan followed the navigation directions until the road narrowed into a private drive bordered by manicured hedges trimmed with exact precision. At the end stood a modern structure of steel and glass that mirrored the sky so completely it seemed almost transparent. A discreet sign near the entrance read Whitmore Holdings in clean silver font. Ethan parked in the visitor section without hesitation. Ranger stepped down first, scanning the surroundings with a calm but alert posture. The air carried the faint scent of cut grass and fountain water drifting from a landscaped courtyard. As Ethan approached the main doors, they opened automatically with a quiet hydraulic glide. Inside, the lobby was expansive yet restrained, marble floors reflecting light from tall windows, a single abstract sculpture positioned at the center like a silent guardian. A receptionist greeted him by name before he spoke, her smile professional and composed. "Miss Whitmore is expecting you, Mr. Cole." Ethan inclined his head slightly, and used to such reception. Ranger remained close to his leg, paused silent against the polished floor. An elevator carried them upward with a smooth, almost weightless motion. Ethan watched the digital numbers ascend while his reflection stood firm in the mirrored wall beside him, denim jacket worn but clean, boots scuffed but steady. When the doors opened, a quiet hallway stretched ahead, lined with framed photographs of community projects, rehabilitation centers, and ribbon cuttings across different states. At the far end, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river that cut through Brookhaven like a silver ribbon. Charlotte waited there, positioned near the glass, her wheelchair turned slightly toward the door as if she had sensed his arrival before the elevator chimed. She wore a tailored cream blouse and charcoal slacks, her posture composed, her expression thoughtful rather than formal. There was no wedding veil now, no uncertain dock beneath her. Only polished floors and the steady hum of a building designed to endure. Ranger stepped forward first, tail held neutral, eyes fixed gently on her. Charlotte's gaze softened immediately. "I am glad you came," she said. Her voice carried the same calm strength he remembered. Ethan approached and stopped a respectful distance away. "You said you were expecting my call," he replied evenly. "I was," she answered without hesitation. "Because yesterday was not a coincidence." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in concentration. She gestured toward a small seating area arranged beside the windows. He remained standing while Ranger settled at his side. Charlotte studied the river below before speaking again. "The dock was scheduled for inspection last month," she said quietly. "It was not repaired in time. I knew there was risk." Ethan absorbed the statement without interrupting. "The ceremony was small on purpose," she continued. "Not because I lacked means, but because I needed clarity." She turned her wheelchair slightly to face him fully. "The man I was meant to marry believed he understood my life. Yesterday proved otherwise." The sunlight behind her cast a soft halo along the edges of her hair, but her eyes remained sharp and steady. "You moved without calculation," she said. "You did not ask who I was. You did not hesitate." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "It did not matter who you were." Ranger's ears flicked at the firmness in his tone. Charlotte nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something long considered. "That," she said softly, "is precisely why you are here." Outside the glass, the river flowed in patient silence, and inside the polished office tower, a different kind of current began to gather between them. The silence that followed Charlotte's request did not feel forced. It felt earned, like the pause between one breath and the next when a decision begins forming before it is spoken. Ethan walked slowly toward the window, stopping a few feet from the glass where the river flowed in patient lines below. The city stretched beyond it, steel and stone rising in quiet authority. He had stood in places like this before, though under different skies, different circumstances. Buildings could look invincible from a distance. He knew better than to trust appearances. "You are offering me responsibility," he said at last, his voice calm but firm. "Not comfort." Charlotte inclined her head slightly. "Responsibility builds something comfort never can." Ranger moved to Ethan's side, pressing lightly against his leg as though steadying him from within. Ethan reached down and rested a hand against the dog's neck, feeling the warmth beneath thick fur. "Why me?" he asked without turning. Charlotte did not answer immediately. Instead, she wheeled herself closer, the soft mechanical hum of her chair barely audible against the room's climate control. "Because you understand what it means to carry silence," she said. "Because you do not speak about service as if it were a badge. You carry it like a weight that shaped you." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "And because," she continued gently, "my foundation has resources but lacks someone who can see the men behind the uniforms." The sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the polished floor. Ethan turned then, meeting her gaze directly. "I am not polished," he said. "I am not trained for boardrooms." "Good," she replied without hesitation. "Boardrooms are not what I need." Ranger stepped forward again, this time circling once before settling between them, as if marking common ground. Charlotte watched the dog thoughtfully. "You both live simply," she observed. "You repair what you can and move on when needed." Ethan nodded faintly. "That is enough." "It should be," she agreed. "But sometimes enough is meant to grow." She gestured toward the photographs still resting on the table. The pilot program would begin here in Brookhaven. Transitional housing for veterans who have nowhere to land. Counseling, job training, community integration. I want it designed with honesty, not charity. Ethan studied the images again. Faces in those frames were not statistics. They were men and women who had once stood watch in distant places, who returned home carrying invisible burdens. He recognized the posture in their shoulders, the guarded expressions. "You expect me to leave what little I have built," he said quietly. Charlotte's voice softened. "I expect you to consider whether what you built was meant to remain temporary." The words lingered in the air. Outside, a barge moved slowly along the river, its wake spreading outward in steady ripples. Ethan felt the old instinct to remain unattached, to avoid any structure that could collapse. Yet he also felt something else, a faint pull toward purpose that had been absent for years. Ranger lifted his head and looked at him directly, ears upright, eyes unwavering. Ethan had learned to trust that gaze more than his own doubt. "If I accept," he said slowly, "this will not be about publicity." "It will not," Charlotte answered firmly. "Your name will not appear in headlines unless you choose it." "And if I walk away after trying?" "Then you walk away with no debt," she said. "You owe me nothing." The simplicity of that statement settled between them like solid ground. Ethan drew a steady breath and looked once more at the river beyond the glass. "I will consider it," he said finally. It was not a full acceptance, but it was no longer refusal. Charlotte's expression shifted, relief quiet and contained. "That is all I ask." Ranger's tail brushed the floor once, a small movement that carried quiet approval. In the reflection of the glass, three figures stood together, not bound by obligation, but by the possibility of building something stronger than the dock that first brought them into one another's lives. The afternoon light began to soften as the meeting drew toward its quiet edge, yet neither Ethan nor Charlotte moved immediately to end it. The river beyond the glass continued its steady course, indifferent to decisions made above it. Ethan remained standing, hands relaxed but mind alert, weighing not the salary or housing she had mentioned, but the gravity of stepping into something larger than himself. Charlotte folded her hands loosely in her lap and regarded him with the patience of someone accustomed to long negotiations, though this did not feel like one. "You asked why you," she said gently. "There is more you should understand." Ethan held her gaze without speaking. "My father built Whitmore Holdings from a single warehouse on the south side of Chicago," she continued. "He believed structures should outlast the men who designed them. When I inherited the company, I expanded it, diversified it, multiplied its worth. On paper, I became a billionaire before I turned 35. She spoke the word without pride, only clarity. But numbers do not measure integrity. Ranger lifted his head slightly at the shift in tone, amber eyes attentive. Charlotte's expression grew reflective. "After my accident 5 years ago, many people treated me as though my worth had diminished. Investors questioned stability. Partners withdrew quietly. The man I intended to marry believed my vulnerability required his management. She offered a faint, knowing smile. He underestimated both my strength and my need for truth. Ethan listened without interruption, the lines of his face steady. Yesterday was not only about a dock, she said. It was about whether the people near me would step forward when stability faltered. Wealth attracts many things, Mr. Cole. Loyalty is not always one of them. Ethan absorbed her words carefully. And you believe I offer loyalty, he said. I believe you offer alignment, she corrected softly. You move toward need, not advantage. The air between them felt measured but no longer tentative. Charlotte gestured toward the far end of the office where a large architectural rendering stood mounted on an easel. It depicted a low brick complex arranged around a central courtyard with trees and walking paths. This is the Brookhaven Transitional Center, she explained. 80 units of housing, medical offices, job training workshops, and communal spaces. It is funded, approved, and ready to break ground. But it requires leadership that understands resilience beyond spreadsheets. Ethan stepped closer to the rendering, studying the layout. He noticed the placement of ramps, the wide corridors, the open green spaces designed not merely for function but for dignity. You built this before meeting me, he observed. Yes, she replied. But I postponed construction. I realized that if the foundation was wrong, the walls would not matter. Ranger rose and followed Ethan, his tail brushing lightly against the edge of the easel. Ethan placed a steadying hand on the dog's back. You are asking me to anchor something that carries your name, he said quietly. I am asking you to anchor something that carries theirs, she answered, gesturing toward the unseen veterans who would one day live within those walls. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the river in deeper shades of copper and rose. Ethan stood in silence for a long moment. He thought of the trailer beneath the cottonwoods, of the narrow bed and the quiet canal. He thought of men he had served beside who had returned to smaller spaces than they deserved. If I say yes, he said slowly, I will expect honesty. No staged photographs. No speeches about charity. Charlotte's eyes brightened slightly. Then we are aligned already. Ranger gave a single soft exhale, as if releasing tension he had been holding since the dock. Ethan looked once more at the rendering, then back at Charlotte. I will not promise perfection, he said. Only effort. Charlotte nodded. Perfection is an illusion. Effort builds legacy. In the reflection of the window, the three figures remained framed against the evening sky, not bound by wealth or status, but by the quiet recognition that sometimes the strongest foundations are formed not from concrete or steel, but from the simple decision to step forward when others step back. The decision did not arrive with thunder or applause. It settled quietly, like dust after construction, visible only when light passed through it at the right angle. Ethan stood before the architectural rendering a few seconds longer, then turned fully toward Charlotte. I will do it, he said, not loudly, not ceremonially, but with the steady tone of a man accepting weight he intends to carry. Ranger's tail moved once against the polished floor, slow and deliberate, as if sealing the moment. Charlotte exhaled in a way that suggested not victory, but relief. Then we begin, she replied. She reached for her phone and sent a brief message, efficient and precise. Within minutes, a knock sounded softly at the office door. A middle-aged man, in a navy suit, entered, holding a thin tablet and a folder. His expression was respectful but curious. Daniel, Charlotte said, this is Ethan Cole. He will be overseeing the Brookhaven Transitional Center. The man inclined his head. We are honored, Mr. Cole. Ethan acknowledged him with a small nod, and used to such formalities. The folder was placed on the table, outlining timelines, land surveys, and projected staffing plans. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he asked, when would construction begin? As soon as leadership confirms final revisions, Daniel answered. Permits are secured. Funding is allocated. Groundbreaking could occur within 30 days. 30 days felt both immediate and distant. Ethan considered the fields outside Millhaven, the trailer by the canal. I will need to review the plans personally, he said. Not here. On site. Charlotte's eyes brightened slightly. Of course, she replied. The land is 20 acres along the south bank of the river, 10 minutes from this building. She wheeled toward the window and gestured toward a stretch of undeveloped green space visible in the distance. It will not look impressive yet, she said softly. Only open earth. Ethan followed her gaze. He had always trusted open ground more than finished structures. Open earth can become anything, he said. Ranger stepped closer to the glass, ears upright as though surveying territory already claimed in spirit. Charlotte turned back toward Ethan. You will not be alone in this, she added. There will be counselors, administrators, contractors. But the direction will come from you. Ethan met her eyes steadily. Then I will need authority to choose some of those people. Granted, she answered without hesitation. The simplicity of her response confirmed that this was no symbolic role. Outside, evening deepened, and the river darkened into shades of indigo. Daniel excused himself quietly, leaving them alone once more. Charlotte regarded Ethan thoughtfully. Your housing can be arranged immediately, she said. A small home near the site. Temporary until the center is complete. Ethan hesitated only briefly. The trailer can be sold, he said. It was not attachment that paused him, but acknowledgement of transition. Ranger leaned gently against his leg, steady as always. Charlotte nodded, understanding the weight behind the simple statement. Transitions are rarely comfortable, she said, but they often reveal what was meant to grow. Ethan walked toward the window again, looking out at the stretch of land that would soon hold walls, corridors, and quiet rooms where veterans could breathe without explanation. For the first time in years, the future did not appear as something to avoid. It appeared as something to shape. He turned back to Charlotte and extended his hand. She reached forward, her grip firm despite the difference in their positions. It was not a handshake of business. It was an agreement rooted in shared intention. Ranger stepped between them, resting his head briefly against both of their knees, as if binding the promise in a way words could not. And in that high office overlooking a darkening river, a new foundation was laid long before a single shovel touched the earth. The next morning broke clear and unseasonably warm, sunlight spilling across the 20 acres of open land along the south bank of the river, where survey flags fluttered in soft red and yellow lines. Ethan stood near the edge of the property with Ranger at his side, boots planted firmly in soil that had not yet been shaped by machinery. The ground was uneven in places, dotted with wild grass and small stones that caught the light. Charlotte arrived in a dark sedan, accompanied only by Daniel, who remained respectfully distant as she wheeled herself across a temporary wooden path laid for access. There were no reporters, no photographers, no ceremonial banners. Only open earth and the quiet hum of wind moving through cottonwoods near the water. Ethan knelt briefly, scooping a handful of soil into his palm. It was dry on the surface but cool beneath, holding potential the way foundations do before concrete is poured. Ranger moved ahead a few steps, nose low, scanning the perimeter as though memorizing its boundaries. Charlotte stopped beside Ethan and followed his gaze toward the river. It does not look like much, she said softly. Not yet, he replied. In the weeks that followed, the land changed steadily. Excavators carved measured lines into the ground. Concrete trucks rolled in before dawn, their engines rumbling low against the morning mist. Steel frames rose like ribs against the sky, outlining corridors and living quarters that would soon shelter men and women searching for stability. Ethan was present each day, not in a suit but in work boots and worn denim, reviewing blueprints with contractors, adjusting ramp inclines by inches, insisting on wider doorways and reinforced handrails. They will carry more than their own weight, he told the construction supervisor. Build accordingly. Ranger became a familiar presence among the crew, walking the perimeter with calm authority, pausing whenever a machine roared too close to unstable ground. The workers began greeting him by name. Charlotte visited often, sometimes observing quietly from the shade of a temporary canopy, other times discussing budget reallocations with firm clarity. She deferred to Ethan on structural decisions, trusting his judgment when he requested additional counseling rooms or expanded communal spaces. Healing does not happen in narrow halls, he said once, and she nodded without question. By the end of the first month, walls stood solid and symmetrical. Windows reflected the river in long panes of blue and silver. The central courtyard took shape, trees planted in careful rows, benches arranged where conversations could unfold without pressure. Inside, paint crews applied warm neutral tones designed to soften rather than institutionalize. Ethan walked through the nearly finished corridor one evening as the sun dipped low, Ranger pacing beside him. The scent of fresh lumber and plaster lingered in the air. He paused at the doorway of what would become the main common room, imagining voices filling the space, stories exchanged without judgment. Charlotte joined him quietly. "You have changed the blueprint more than you realize," she said. "Only where it needed it," he replied. She studied his profile in the fading light. "The board has noticed," she added. "They asked why I placed operational authority in your hands." Ethan glanced toward her. "And what did you tell them?" "That foundations require people who understand cracks before they appear," she answered. Ranger moved toward the open doorway and stood there, framed by the orange glow of sunset. Outside, the river flowed unchanged, but within these new walls something steadier was forming. Charlotte looked at the building, then back at Ethan. "The first residents arrive in 2 weeks," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. The weight of responsibility no longer felt foreign. It felt purposeful. And as evening settled over the nearly completed center, the structure stood not as a monument to wealth, but as proof that sometimes the strongest bridges are built by those who once learned to cross uncertain ground without assurance of who would stand beside them. The first residents arrived on a quiet Monday morning beneath a sky brushed with pale autumn light. There were no banners, no brass bands, only a row of modest vehicles pulling into the newly paved lot as leaves drifted softly across the courtyard. Ethan stood near the entrance with Ranger at his side, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his work jacket. The building behind him no longer smelled of fresh paint alone. It carried the faint warmth of brewed coffee and polished wood, the quiet readiness of rooms prepared to hold new stories. One by one, the men and women stepped out of their cars, some carrying duffel bags, others holding nothing but a folded envelope and guarded expressions. Ethan greeted each of them with a simple nod and a handshake when offered. He did not speak of programs or policies. He said only, "Welcome. You are safe here." Ranger moved among them gently, pausing beside those whose shoulders remained tight, offering silent reassurance without demand. Inside, the common room filled slowly with conversation that began in fragments and grew into steady voices. Sunlight filtered through tall windows and landed across the wide corridor floors, illuminating photographs already mounted along the walls. Not portraits of donors or executives, but images of veterans rebuilding engines, planting gardens, studying at desks set against river views. Charlotte observed from the courtyard path, her wheelchair positioned beneath the shade of a young maple tree whose leaves shimmered in gold. She did not interrupt the flow. She simply watched as Ethan guided a newly arrived resident toward a counseling office, his tone calm and grounded. Later that afternoon, a small orientation gathering formed in the courtyard. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle beneath open sky. Ethan stood at the center, Ranger seated attentively beside him. "This place is not charity," he said evenly. "It is a foundation. You will build what stands here as much as any of us." His words were simple, without flourish, yet they carried the weight of lived experience. A man in his early 50s raised his hand and asked quietly, "And if we falter?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we steady each other." Ranger shifted slightly, tail brushing the grass as if affirming the promise. Charlotte felt the words settle deep within her chest. The center did not feel like a corporate extension of Whitmore Holdings. It felt alive, shaped by voices that would carry it forward long after contracts expired. As evening approached, the courtyard lights flickered on in soft amber tones. Residents gathered along the riverbank walkway, some standing alone, others beginning conversations that stretched beyond introductions. Ethan walked the perimeter as he always had, scanning not for threat, but for imbalance, for subtle signs of isolation that required quiet intervention. Ranger trotted beside him, pausing once to sit near a young woman who stared at the water with distant eyes. She reached down slowly and rested her hand against his head. In that small exchange, something unspoken eased. Charlotte rolled toward the edge of the courtyard and looked across the 20 acres that had once been open earth. Now it held walls, windows, and voices woven together by intention. She caught Ethan's eye from across the grass. There was no need for words between them. The dock that had once wavered beneath uncertain footing felt far away now, replaced by solid ground shaped through deliberate choice. As night settled fully over Brookhaven, the river reflected the lights of the center in steady lines of gold. Ethan stood beneath the wide sky, Ranger leaning gently against his leg, and felt a quiet understanding rise within him. He had not been searching for redemption or recognition. Yet in stepping forward without calculation, he had found something steadier than either. Sometimes the strongest inheritance is not measured in wealth, but in the lives that begin to stand upright because someone chose not to step back.